Hey guys, tonight we begin with a little journey. Not too far, not too fast. Just let your mind settle in. Dim the lights, grab a blanket if you have one nearby, and maybe a cup of tea that's more herbal than caffeinated. Because caffeine and ancient Egyptian curses don't really mix. Trust me. Now, we're drifting back to Egypt. Not the Egypt of airport security and sunburned tourists posing with camels. No, this is the Egypt of tombs. Heavy stone doors, wall paintings that took decades to finish, and a society that loved its royals so much it buried them with everything they owned, plus a few unlucky servants. And, of course, the ever-popular rumors of curses. You know, the whole open this tomb and everyone dies kind of thing. The kind of curse that makes a great headline, but also keeps you wondering whether the pharaohs were serious or if it was just very aggressive ancient marketing. So let's sink in slowly. Because the idea of a cursed tomb isn't really about horror jump scares. It's more like a calm, long sigh from the desert sands. All right, first things first. Did the ancient Egyptians actually write curses on their tombs? The answer is sort of, which is historian speak for yes, but not in the way you want it to be. Some tombs do have inscriptions warning people not to disturb the dead. They're usually polite, but firm, kind of like an ancient version of no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. Except the Egyptians would say something like, "He who disturbs this tomb, may a crocodile eat him, and may the desert scorpions sting him until he dies." A little more colorful, sure, but not exactly the same as a supernatural curse that floats out of the tomb and hunts you down like a sandstorm ghost. And then there's Tutankhamun, the boy king, the face of every museum gift shop. His tomb, discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter, is where the modern curse craze really began. Reporters noticed that several people connected to the discovery died, sometimes in unusual ways, and suddenly, the curse of the Pharaoh was born. Newspapers loved it, because nothing sells like a dead archaeologist with a mysterious backstory. Now, before we start counting bodies, let's remember, Egypt in the 1920s was not exactly a place of clean air and hand sanitizer. People got sick, people died, and sometimes those people happened to know an archaeologist. Coincidence? Probably. But the curse made better copy.
Let's float back even further, though. Before Tut, before Carter, before British newspapers started screaming headlines. The Egyptians themselves believed that tombs were sacred spaces, not tourist attractions, not museums, just quiet, eternal resting places. The walls were covered with texts and spells, what we call the Book of the Dead, guiding the king through the afterlife. And yes, sometimes these spells had a bit of a protective edge. The basic idea was, disturb me and the gods will handle you. Not in a subtle way either. The gods in question were often crocodile-headed, jackal-faced, or falcon-eyed. Imagine that nightmare committee showing up at your door. One of the earliest curse inscriptions we have is from the Old Kingdom, around 2400 BCE. It says, and I'm paraphrasing here, "As for anyone who will enter this tomb, the crocodile will be against him in the water, the snake against him on the earth, and the hippopotamus against him in the water." Which, to be honest, sounds less like a curse and more like a particularly bad day at the zoo. But the point was clear. Leave the dead alone. Now, let's drift back to Tutankhamun, because he's the big star in all this. His tomb is not the grandest. It's actually kind of small, possibly because he died young and unexpectedly. But it's one of the only tombs found nearly intact. Gold everywhere. Furniture, jewelry, even food offerings still inside. For archaeologists, it was like hitting the jackpot. Howard Carter opened the tomb in November 1922. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, was there too. And here's where the curse gets its modern PR launch. Just a few months later, Carnarvon died. He'd been bitten by a mosquito, the bite got infected, and with 1920s medicine being what it was, he didn't make it. Cue the headlines. Pharaoh's curse strikes down Lord Carnarvon. Never mind that dozens of other people who entered the tomb lived long, boring lives. The papers only needed one juicy death to sell the story. And there were plenty of little details to spice it up, like the fact that at the moment Carnarvon died, all the lights in Cairo supposedly went out, which sounds dramatic until you realize Cairo's power grid in 1923 wasn't exactly reliable. Or the fact that Carnarvon's dog, thousands of miles away in England, dropped dead at the same moment, which is either a tragic coincidence or the world's first international Pharaoh dog curse, depending on your mood. Let's pause here and float sideways, because the curse wasn't just about Tutankhamun. It tied into a much older fascination the West had with Egypt.
For centuries, Europeans were obsessed with mummies. In the Middle Ages, they even ground up mummy powder and sold it as medicine. Yes, you heard that right. People literally ate mummies, because nothing says healthy glow like powdered ancient flesh. By the 19th century, wealthy Victorians were holding mummy unwrapping parties. Guests would gather around as someone unwrapped a mummy for entertainment. It was part science, part spectacle, and entirely disrespectful. So by the time Tut's tomb was opened, people already half believed that mummies carried mysterious powers. The curse was just the logical next step. And to be fair, there were other deaths. A few people involved in the excavation died in the years following. Not a shocking number, but enough to keep the rumor alive. A British lord, a radiologist, even Carter's secretary. Each one gave the newspapers a new chance to whisper, "The curse has struck again." Meanwhile, Carter himself, the man who actually spent the most time in the tomb, lived for another 17 years. He died in 1939 at the respectable age of 64 from lymphoma. Not exactly a pharaoh zapping him with lightning, unless the gods were playing the very long game. So, were there real curses? Historically speaking, not really. The Egyptians weren't leaving booby-trapped spells behind every door. They were more concerned with helping their kings navigate the afterlife than scaring off future archaeologists. But the idea of a curse stuck around, partly because it's spooky, partly because it made archaeology sound glamorous and dangerous, and partly because it let people imagine that the pharaohs were still reaching across time, still powerful even after 3,000 years in the sand. And honestly, isn't that a little comforting? That a boy king like Tutankhamun, who ruled for less than a decade and died before turning 20, could still make headlines centuries later, even if it's because of a mosquito and a few unlucky coincidences? Let's drift a little further to some other cursed tomb stories, because Tut wasn't alone. He just had the best publicist.
All right, let's settle back in. You're still here? Still cozy, I hope. Maybe you've adjusted your pillow or pulled the blanket up just a little higher. Good, because the desert sands of Egypt still have plenty of curses left to whisper. Now, Tutankhamun may have hogged the spotlight, but he wasn't the only pharaoh with a reputation for being cranky in the afterlife. Plenty of other tombs had warnings carved into them.
Think of them less like horror movie curses and more like "do not disturb" signs written in hieroglyphs, the ancient version of hanging that little hotel door tag outside. One tomb inscription from Saqqara bluntly reads, "As for every man who shall enter this tomb, I shall seize his neck like a bird," which, first of all, proves that goose metaphors are timeless. Second, it shows just how personal Egyptians made their curses. They weren't just vague threats. They were like, "This is my house, and I will personally goose neck you if you mess with it." Another tomb, belonging to Antifi, warns that anyone who dares to harm the grave will face judgment in the afterlife, and their family line will be destroyed. That's a heavy one. Not only do you get punished, but so does your entire bloodline. That's not just a curse. That's generational spite carved in stone.
Now, while all these curses existed, they weren't sprinkled on every wall like hieroglyphic wallpaper. Most tombs were actually filled with prayers, hymns, and cheerful welcome to the afterlife scenes. The curses are the exception, not the rule, which makes sense. Imagine if every gravestone in a modern cemetery had, "Rest in peace, but if you step on this grass, may lightning strike your whole family." Cemeteries would be a lot scarier, and lawnmowers would definitely be out of business. Let's drift back to the 19th century for a moment, because this is when curses really got their PR glow-up. Western explorers loved the idea of being cursed. It made them sound bold, adventurous, slightly doomed. All good things when you're writing back home to donors. In fact, some Egyptologists suspected that local Egyptian workers deliberately encouraged curse rumors. Imagine you're a villager watching Europeans dig up your sacred ancestors. You don't have much power to stop them, but you can whisper, "Careful, sir, the curse will get you." Suddenly, the diggers are a little nervous, and you, the local, have planted just enough superstition to keep things balanced. It was probably the cheapest form of protest in history. Of course, the cursed tomb legend didn't stay in Egypt. It spread everywhere. Victorian seances would feature Egyptian spirits. Gothic novels were filled with mummy revenge plots, and even Hollywood jumped in. The 1932 movie The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff, was directly inspired by Tutankhamun's supposed curse. Without Lord Carnarvon's infected mosquito bite, we might never have had decades of bandage-wrapped movie monsters. So in a strange way, the curse gave birth to one of the longest-running horror franchises in film history. Thanks, Tut. Your tomb didn't just hold gold, it also gave Universal Studios steady box office returns. But let's get back to Egypt itself, because there's another angle worth mentioning. Modern scientists have suggested that some of the cursed deaths might actually have had natural explanations. Tombs sealed for thousands of years are basically microbial time capsules. Inside, you could find ancient mold spores, bacteria, even bat guano. Not exactly a spa environment. So if an archaeologist with a weak immune system went inside, breathed deeply, and then got sick, well, the gods didn't need to lift a finger. The fungi had it covered. There's even been speculation that Lord Carnarvon's infection may have worsened because of bacteria he picked up while inside the tomb. Not proven, but it's a neat explanation. Less glamorous than a pharaoh's wrath, but more medically sound. Still, there's something irresistible about thinking that the ancient kings were watching over their tombs, protecting them across millennia. Even if the curse was just coincidence plus mold, the idea gives their legacy a kind of spooky dignity. It's like the pharaohs saying, "We may be long dead, but don't forget, we're still kind of a big deal."
And then there's Howard Carter himself. Remember, the man who opened Tut's tomb. He spent years cataloging the artifacts, lived a long life, died peacefully at home. The supposed curse didn't touch him. Which raises the question, if the pharaohs were handing out punishments, why skip the main culprit? Maybe Carter was simply too stubborn to curse. Or maybe, just maybe, The pharaohs had a sense of humor. Let the press run wild, let the curse stories grow, and let Carter live just long enough to see his discovery become one of the most famous in history. If so, that's a pretty refined sense of irony. Let's drift out of Tut's tomb now and into some other Egyptian legends. There's a story about a cursed statue known as the Unlucky Mummy, which supposedly sank the Titanic. It wasn't actually a mummy, just a coffin lid, but the rumor went that its owners suffered endless misfortune. Eventually, the story claimed, it was being shipped on the Titanic when the ship sank. Spoiler, it wasn't. The artifact never left the British Museum. But the rumor lived on anyway, because Mummy Sinks Titanic is a much juicier headline than museum label misread. At this point, you can see the pattern. The curses were rarely Egyptian in origin. They were Western anxieties, Western imaginations wrapped around ancient artifacts like so much linen. The Egyptians had their own spiritual framework. They weren't writing horror stories, they were writing prayers. It was the Victorians, the journalists, and the movie producers who turned it into ghost stories. And honestly, that might be the greatest curse of all. To be misinterpreted forever. To have your eternal rest turned into a tabloid headline. Poor pharaohs. They wanted quiet eternity. Instead, they got front-page news and Halloween costumes. So, did pharaohs really leave deadly curses? The calm answer, floating gently through history, is no. But did human imagination create them anyway, out of fear, superstition, and the occasional unlucky death? Absolutely. And that's where the curse lives on. Not in the tombs, not in the sand, but in our own fascination with what might lurk just beyond the stone door. Let's drift now even slower, toward the wider world of cursed history. Egypt may be the poster child, but it's not the only place where death, dynasty, and superstition have mingled. We'll keep that same sleepy pace and slide into more strange tales of rulers, nobles, and the occasional family tree that look more like a tangled ball of yarn.
Welcome back. Still tucked in, I hope? We've been floating around the deserts of Egypt, through tombs filled with hieroglyphs and gold, and curses that were more newspaper drama than divine wrath. But let's lean sideways now, because Egypt wasn't the only place where people thought the elite were carrying supernatural bad luck. Kings and queens across the world had their own versions of curses, sometimes written, sometimes whispered, and sometimes built right into their family trees. It's a funny thing. When something goes wrong in royal life, people rarely blame, say, poor governance, or the fact that inbreeding was the family hobby. No, it's easier, and definitely more poetic, to blame a curse. It gives history a dramatic flourish, and frankly, it makes bedtime stories like this one feel more magical. So, let's float away from the pyramids and into a different kind of tomb, the metaphorical ones the dynasties dug for themselves. Let's start with the Habsburgs, because of course we do. The Habsburg family ruled half of Europe for centuries, mostly by marrying each other until their family tree resembled a knotted shoelace. By the 17th century, their faces had become living proof that genetics sometimes need a little variety. You've probably heard of the Habsburg jaw, that famously protruding chin that kept growing more dramatic generation after generation. By the time we get to Charles II of Spain, his jaw was so prominent he could barely chew, which is not ideal when your entire diet is meat, bread, and wine. Now, Charles II is sometimes described as the most inbred monarch in history. He was also sickly,
infertile, and plagued with mysterious ailments his entire life. Did the Habsburgs call it bad genetics? No. They often blamed a curse. Convenient, right? Blame a witch, not centuries of cousin-on-cousin marriage. The rumor was that Charles's infertility and illnesses were the result of a spell cast on the family centuries earlier when an earlier queen allegedly dabbled in dark magic. The poor man became known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, which is both sad and kind of theatrical. His advisors would call exorcists, sprinkle holy water, and try every ritual imaginable to break the curse. Spoiler, it didn't work. Charles died childless at 38. His dynasty ended, and Spain handed the crown over to the Bourbons. So maybe it was a curse. Or maybe, just maybe, marrying your niece isn't the best long-term health plan. But the Habsburgs didn't have a monopoly on royal curses. The Stuarts of Scotland and England have their own share. Mary, Queen of Scots, spent half her life being miserable and then got executed. Her son, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, liked to think he was cursed by witches. In fact, he was so convinced that witchcraft was out to get him, he wrote a whole book on the subject, Demonology. Basically, it was an early modern how to spot a witch guide, which would have been less ironic if he didn't also believe himself divinely protected. Cursed one moment, chosen by God the next. Royals really did enjoy having it both ways. Then we have the tragic line of the French monarchy. The Bourbons, technically successors to the bewitched Habsburgs, weren't exactly lucky themselves. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette famously lost their heads in the French Revolution. Later, Louis XVII, their young son, died in prison at the age of 10 after years of neglect. And then, when the monarchy tried to restore itself, wave after wave of revolutions and assassinations seemed to block them. People whispered, the Bourbons must be cursed. Or, maybe they just weren't very good at adjusting to democracy. But cursed by fate has a nicer bedtime rhythm than refused to reform and got guillotined.
Let's float back east for a moment. The Romanovs of Russia, yes, the ones with Fabergé eggs and Rasputin, also carried a family curse of sorts. Not the tomb curse variety, but the genetic kind. Hemophilia ran in their bloodline, thanks to Queen Victoria of England, who generously spread the disease to half of Europe's royals through her children. Imagine being called the grandmother of Europe, but your main genetic legacy is a bleeding disorder. That's one way to be remembered. For the Romanovs, the curse centered on Alexei, the only son of Tsar Nicholas II. His hemophilia meant he could bleed to death from the smallest injury. The family saw this as divine punishment, or at least as a mark of doom. Enter Rasputin, the so-called mad monk, who convinced them he could heal the boy. Spoiler, he couldn't, but he did worm his way into the royal family, turning them into a walking circus of scandal and paranoia. When the dynasty finally collapsed in 1917, people said the Romanovs had been cursed from the start. It's not hard to see why. And here's the interesting thread tying all these curses together. The royals themselves often leaned into the idea. If you're weak, sick, or unlucky, saying you're cursed feels better than admitting you're genetically fragile, politically clumsy, or just having a very bad day. A curse turns personal failure into a cosmic drama, much more glamorous, much more narratable. Now, you might be wondering, what does this have to do with Egypt? Well, everything and nothing. Because just as tomb curses gave Westerners a supernatural explanation for why people died, royal curses gave monarchies a supernatural excuse for why their dynasties collapsed. Whether it was a pharaoh's tomb, a Spanish king's chin, or a Russian heir's fragile veins, the pattern repeats. When reality feels too bleak, humans reach for curses. And honestly, it makes for better bedtime stories. Nobody wants to drift off thinking about hemophilia or political reform. But a mysterious curse passed down through centuries? That's the kind of thing you can mull over while staring at the ceiling. So, if we step back, the pharaohs never really cursed us. Not with supernatural lightning bolts, at least. But they may have inspired the world's imagination to keep inventing curses long after their stones were sealed. Because once you start believing kings and queens can control fate from beyond the grave, you don't really stop. And with that thought, let's drift further still, into more examples of dynastic misfortune, strange coincidences, and royals who seem to spend more time dying tragically than ruling successfully.
Welcome back. Still cozy under the blankets, maybe with the soft hum of a fan or the gentle rustle of sheets. We're going to drift even further into the world of dynastic misfortune, where cursed tombs, inbred families, and unlucky monarchs all collide in a slow, mesmerizing stream of history. No rush, no drama, just the soft cadence of centuries of human folly. Let's start with another branch of the Habsburg family, because, of course, genetics never sleeps. The Spanish Habsburgs were especially famous, or infamous, for a certain facial characteristic that has entered history books as the Habsburg jaw. It was a jawline so pronounced that it could have had its own zip code. And yes, the family probably spent more time chewing carefully than ruling efficiently. But beyond aesthetics, the genetic quirks had real consequences. Charles II of Spain, whom we met briefly before, was not only infertile, but plagued by numerous health issues. Epilepsy, digestive problems, weak bones, and chronic illness made daily life a feat of endurance. His advisors blamed a curse, naturally. After all, it's more romantic to imagine dark magic than admit the results of centuries of cousin marriage. And yet, Charles II ruled until his death. His kingdom, meanwhile, was slowly rotting under neglect. Could the curse have been more psychological than mystical? Perhaps. But the legend endures, whispered every time historians mention the last Habsburg king of Spain. Next, let's float over to France for a while. The Bourbons had their fair share of troubles. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are probably the most famous examples, thanks to their theatrical downfall. They didn't just have misfortune. They had the kind of collective bad luck that could inspire 1,000 historians to sigh heavily. The young Louis XVII, their son, suffered terribly after his parents' deaths. Locked away, neglected, and dying at only 10 years old, he became an unwitting symbol of what people called the Bourbon curse. If you're counting, that's 3 generations of tragic outcomes in a relatively short historical frame time. Not exactly a clean record for a royal family. But of course, people blamed fate, or curse, rather than social upheaval, political mismanagement, and revolutionary fervor. Meanwhile, over in Scotland and England, the Stuarts had their own share of whispered doom. Mary, Queen of Scots, spent her life navigating political intrigue, imprisonment, and eventually execution. Her son, James VI, and I, carried on the family fascination with witchcraft. He was so convinced of the supernatural that he wrote Daemonology, a kind of handbook for identifying witches. It's important to note that James ruled for decades after Mary's execution, so the curse was selective, at least if it existed at all. Perhaps curses are like cats. They visit where they please and ignore the people who really want them to land. Let's drift a little eastward to Russia. The Romanovs were a royal family with both fortune and fragility. Hemophilia entered their bloodline thanks to Queen Victoria, making the male heirs especially vulnerable. Alexei, the only son of Nicholas II, needed constant care and attention. Every minor cut could turn into a life-threatening event. Enter Rasputin, the mad monk, who convinced the family he could heal the boy. Rasputin was about as helpful as a chocolate teapot, but his presence only fueled rumors of curses, divine punishment, and inevitable downfall. And when the Russian Revolution finally swept through, the Romanovs were executed. Historians debate whether it was fate, politics, or a curse, but for anyone telling a bedtime story, cursed family is far more compelling than politically incompetent.
And speaking of Egypt, let's circle back gently. The idea of a curse doesn't end with the tomb or the pharaoh. It floats through modern history, wrapping itself around archaeologists, museum curators, and even unsuspecting tourists. Take the case of the so-called unlucky mummy, a coffin lid rather than a mummy, which allegedly caused misfortune for everyone it touched. The artifact never actually left the British Museum, yet newspapers gleefully reported disasters wherever the story traveled. Titanic sinking? Blame the mummy. Museum workers falling ill? Definitely the mummy. These tales are more about human psychology than Pharaoh's wrath, but they're effective nonetheless. The Victorian obsession with mummies fueled this myth. Mummy unwrapping parties became a social phenomenon among the British elite. Guests gathered to watch archaeologists, or sometimes entertainers, unwrap mummies for amusement. Imagine the quiet horror of an ancient Egyptian priest if he were somehow observing the 19th century. His tomb, which was meant to be a peaceful resting place, had become the centerpiece of a spectacle. If he cursed anything, it was probably his own insomnia. And yet, people believed, partly because it made archaeology exciting, partly because it allowed the imagination to roam free, and partly because the Western fascination with Egypt's past required a little supernatural seasoning. A tomb that's just a pile of stones isn't very interesting, but a tomb that might strike you dead if you breathe too hard? Now we're talking bedtime story territory. We can see a common thread now. Across continents and centuries, the elite, whether pharaohs, Habsburgs, Bourbons, or Romanovs, seem to invite tragedy. And humans, being humans, add layers of narrative, whispers of curses, and theatrical explanations. It's easier to imagine fate and magic than to confront mundane explanations, like genetics, illness, or bad political judgment. Even in Egypt, the pharaohs probably never intended for future archaeologists to die. The curse is a product of imagination, coincidence, and sensational journalism. But it sticks. It drifts through history like a slow-moving sandstorm, touching every royal line it encounters, leaving stories of doom, intrigue, and quiet melancholy. So, what can we take away tonight? Perhaps that curses are less about supernatural power and more about human storytelling. They give shape to tragedy, elegance to coincidence, and charm to misfortune. They make history gently, endlessly fascinating, even in a monotone narration meant to soothe you into sleep. And if you ever visit Egypt, or wander through the halls of a European palace, or peek at a family tree riddled with intermarriage, remember this: the curse isn't always in the tomb, the crown, or the royal bloodline. Sometimes it's in the way we tell stories about them. It's the subtle, lingering curiosity that keeps these tales alive, whispered from one generation to the next, long after the actual pharaohs, kings, and queens have drifted into the past. Here we are again, still floating, still calm. The desert sands are behind us, but the stories of cursed rulers and unlucky dynasties still stretch out like an endless horizon. And now, instead of tomb inscriptions and family trees, let's wander into something a little more personal. Because sometimes the so-called curse wasn't carved on stone or written in bloodlines. Sometimes it was just the monarch peeing themselves. Take Akhenaten, for example, Pharaoh of Egypt in the 14th century BCE. He's the one who tried to change everything about Egyptian religion. Instead of worshiping a whole pantheon of gods, jackals, falcons, crocodiles, the whole animal kingdom, he decided Egypt should worship one god, Aten, the sun disk. It was, in some ways, the first great monotheistic experiment. The problem? People didn't like it. Egyptians loved their gods. They liked having a crocodile deity for the Nile, a falcon god for the sky, and a jackal-headed guardian for the dead. They weren't interested in trading that whole colorful crowd for a glowing circle. Akhenaten forced the issue anyway. He closed temples, moved the capital, and made the sun disk the only focus of worship. To put it bluntly, he became that guy at the party who insists everyone listen to his new playlist instead of enjoying the classics. When he died, Egyptians basically erased him from history. They smashed his statues, abandoned his city, and went back to their many gods like nothing had happened. Was it a curse? Maybe not in the spooky sense, but his entire religious revolution collapsed faster than you can say solar disk. His legacy became a cautionary tale. Don't mess with Egyptian religion unless you're ready to have your memory systematically deleted. And then there's his son, well, probably his son, Tutankhamun, our old friend Tut, the boy king who died young, whose tomb gave the modern world its favorite bedtime curse. But Tut's life itself feels unlucky. He became pharaoh around the age of 9, which sounds fun until you realize that ruling an empire as a child usually means being a puppet for more powerful adults. His main job was looking decorative while advisors ran the country. He also suffered from health problems. Evidence suggests he had a club foot, malaria, and fragile bones. Hardly the makings of a glorious warrior pharaoh. He died before 20. Some think it was an accident, maybe a broken leg gone wrong. Others imagine murder. Either way, his reign was brief, his body weak, and his afterlife legendary. In a way, Tutankhamun was cursed with fame, not in life, but in death. Millions of tourists know his golden mask, but few know the actual boy behind it. He's remembered more as a mummy than as a man, which, if you think about it, is its own kind of curse. Let's float gently out of Egypt again, across the Mediterranean into Europe's royal courts. Because if you want to see lives that look cursed, you don't have to go digging in the Valley of the Kings. You can just peek into Versailles or Madrid or Vienna. Take Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor in the 18th century. He spent years worrying about who would inherit his throne. He even wrote a law, the Pragmatic Sanction, to make sure his daughter Maria Theresa could rule after him. He made every European power swear they'd respect it. And then, when he died, they all ignored it. His daughter inherited constant war instead of peace. Charles's obsession with succession planning turned out to be pointless. If curses exist, bureaucracy might be one of them.
Or how about Louis XIV's family in France? Louis himself, the Sun King, lived long and reigned even longer. But his descendants weren't so lucky. Most of his direct heirs died young. Smallpox, measles, or other infections sweeping through Versailles. Out of all his children and grandchildren, hardly anyone survived long enough to inherit. By the time Louis died at 77, the heir to the throne was a 5-year-old great-grandson, which is not ideal for continuity.
Some said it was the curse of extravagance. Versailles was beautiful, yes, but it was also a petri dish of disease. Imagine thousands of courtiers crowding into golden rooms, breathing the same air, drinking the same wine, and rarely washing their hands. If the walls of Versailles were cursed, the curse's name was epidemics. Then there's the tragic figure of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi. She was a 19th century royal who looked like a fairy tale princess on the outside, but whose life was marked by endless sorrow. Her son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in a murder-suicide pact at Merling, shocking the empire. Elizabeth herself grew more reclusive, traveling constantly, almost as if she were running from her own life. And in the end, she was assassinated by an anarchist in Geneva, stabbed with a sharpened file. People called it fate, bad luck, a curse. Really, it was the combination of personal grief, political unrest, and the risks of being famous in a changing world. But bedtime stories don't care about socioeconomic context. They prefer curses. They make the sadness easier to whisper in the dark. And then, of course, the Romanovs again. We already mentioned hemophilia and Rasputin, but the everyday lives of Nicholas II's family had their own cursed rhythm. Imagine being an empress like Alexandra, watching your only son bleed from minor injuries, clinging to a monk who claimed to heal him, while the empire itself was falling apart outside your palace gates. It's the kind of stress that makes people believe in doom, because how else do you explain that level of personal tragedy colliding with national collapse? If we take a step back, the pattern feels almost soothing in its repetition. Monarchs rise. Monarchs fall. Families intermarry, weaken, and eventually vanish. Sometimes tombs are robbed, sometimes thrones are toppled, and sometimes children inherit more sorrow than crowns. And in each case, a curse lingers, maybe in the inscriptions on a limestone wall, maybe in a family's collective misfortune, maybe in the way history chooses to remember them. But it's always there, floating, not scary, not shocking, just quietly, inevitably present. So maybe the curse isn't really a spell at all. Maybe it's the quiet, universal truth that even the most powerful people are fragile. Pharaohs die young. Emperors worry themselves into irrelevance. Queens mourn their children. Dynasties vanish like sand slipping through fingers. And we, centuries later, call it a curse because the word is more comforting than the silence of inevitability.